So I just finished watching The Suicide Squad for the second time, and as I mentioned previously, I found the movie a lot more enjoyable on my rewatch. That's not to say that this movie is completely flawless, and in fact there are some pretty glaring story structure issues that I still found myself a bit hung up on the rewatch. However, I do have to give James Gunn credit for creating a very fun, irreverent, and psychotic, to be quite frank, movie. But like I said, there are still some story structure issues that need to be addressed, and that's what I'm here to do today. I'm going to be going through the Suicide Squad looking at pure story structure. I'm not going to be considering anything like the acting, directing, how the movie is shot, how it's edited, anything like that. I'm just looking purely at the story, how it's structured, how it flows, and what could have been done better. I'm going to be going through the story structure using the tools given to us by two great storytellers, first being Dan Harmon, creator of Community, Rick and Morty, and Harmontown, and many others, and John Truby, whose book Anatomy of the Story is probably one of the definitive tomes in terms of how to write and create a good story. And in fact, I have used tools that both of these men have given us to create what I consider to be my blueprint when I'm creating, writing, and evaluating a story. It's a combination of Dan Harmon's story circle and Truby's 22-step story structure. I've taken Harmon's 8-step story circle and added in each of the 22 story structures that Truby discusses on the outside, so you can see where they generally tend to fit in as far as those 8 steps. And also, you can see that the 8-step story structure also can fit itself into the classic 5-act play structure. It's worth noting that not every one of Truby's steps necessarily needs to be present or needs to be done in the exact order that they're laid out here. He's very clear about that, and I tend to agree that these steps are a bit more flexible. They can sometimes go out of order depending on how the story goes. None of these are hard and fast rules. This is just how I sort of view the tools that they've given us and how they can work together. And this is how I will be using them to go through and evaluate the Suicide Squad. Again, not holding the movie to these hard and fast rules, but figuring out how it fits that structure, what points it does well, and what points maybe are a bit lacking. So we start off with the first point, which is you, referring of course to the protagonist. Now, the Suicide Squad is an ensemble cast, which means there isn't really a central protagonist. Now, that's not really a problem because in ensemble characters, you'll often see one character kind of rise to the forefront, and that's what happens in the Suicide Squad. Truby says that the protagonist is your quote-unquote best character, which means the most interesting one. So when we're looking at all the different villains that make up the Suicide Squad, the group, we really have to come down to about 4 or 5 characters that we would say are the most interesting that could be in the contention for protagonist. And as much as I love Nanaue and how adorable he is, he's not really in the protagonist discussion. So there's really 4 key candidates: Bloodsport, Harley Quinn, Rick Flag, and Peacemaker. Throughout the course of this movie, one of those characters is going to be dead, another will end up being a secondary antagonist, so those 2, Rick Flag and Peacemaker, are out. That really leaves Harley Quinn and Bloodsport, and I think it's safe to say that Bloodsport is of greater focus in this movie than Harley Quinn. We get more information about Bloodsport's backstory with his relationship to his daughter, and he's sort of the one who takes up the mantle of leadership in the Suicide Squad at the movie's climax. We're going to talk about self-revelation, need, and desire throughout the story because we're going to see them come up in different scenarios. The first self-revelation, need, and desire is all about where our protagonist starts the movie. So in this case, our protagonist, Bloodsport, starts the movie in prison. What does he want? What is his objective? Well, his objective is to not join the Suicide Squad. That's really all that we get. We have 2 scenes of him in prison, one of which is him rejecting Lawler's offer, and the second is arguing with his daughter and basically describing their relationship, which is not good. As far as his initial need, both psychological and moral, we don't really have anything for Bloodsport. We don't know that much about his personality, we don't know that much about his backstory, we don't know why he is the person that he is when we first meet him. we don't get that much information about how his past experiences have informed the person that he is today. As Truby says, there are psychological and moral needs in a movie. A psychological need is something that the character needs to overcome within themselves to become a more rounded, better person. And a moral need is something that they need to understand about themselves in order to change the way that they treat others. So in this case, it's pretty obvious that there is more of a moral need for Bloodsport than a psychological one, and his moral need is the ability to treat others better and to become a leader. We see in his two initial introduction scenes, he's very nasty to his daughter, and he openly dismisses Waller's invitation to become the leader of the Suicide Squad. So those are two things that we learn right off the bat about Bloodsport that are going to be his needs. Now, the desire is the object or the destination, the actual thing in the movie that the protagonist wants. So in this case, Bloodsport's desire is to join the Suicide Squad in order to protect his daughter and keep her from going to jail. And right off the bat, this causes a big problem, because we just established that Bloodsport's moral weakness is that he needs to be more caring and compassionate towards others in his life, including his daughter. But now we learn that his desire is to protect his daughter, which sort of invalidates this moral need that he has. And maybe it means that his moral need is actually just learning to become a leader, but I don't really think that that's the case, given that in later scenes, like the one in the bus with Ratcatcher, we see him talking about how she reminds him of his daughter and how he's going to take care of her and get her out of there alive. So it does seem like the movie believes that his moral need is to become a more caring and compassionate person towards others, and yet his desire is reflective of the fact that he already can kind of do that. And this is really where the lack of a ghost for our protagonist hurts him. The ghost is a term for a person or an event that kind of shapes the protagonist and makes them who they are internally. It could be an abusive parent, it could be living a life of poverty, it could be living a life of luxury and being spoiled as a result. But the ghost is the thing that makes the character have their moral weakness, which we'll talk about in a minute. And since we don't know anything about Bloodsport before he got to jail, other than he has a daughter that he doesn't want and that he shot Superman and put him in the ICU, we don't really understand why he is the way that he is and why he doesn't care for others. So to recap, we have our protagonist, Bloodsport. He has a moral need, which is learn to treat others with more compassion and possibly learn to become a better leader. His desire, though, is to protect his daughter, which does not square with the moral need that he has. So now we progress to the second step in Harmon's story circle, the need, which he describes as the something isn't right here sort of step. And by this he means that there's something not right with our protagonist, which we've already kind of discussed as far as his moral need to treat others better. But the moral need also grows out of a moral weakness. Truby says that there are both psychological and moral weaknesses which feed into those needs. And in this case, his moral weakness is that he doesn't care about others. He is callous, he is selfish. And that's fine. That's a very good moral weakness to have. And so what we're going to be watching throughout this movie is how that moral weakness changes as a result of his experiences. That's what makes a good movie. A character grows and changes over the course of a story because of the things that they experience. So then we get to the inciting incident, which in this case is the event that causes Bloodsport to join the Suicide Squad, when Amanda Waller threatens to send his daughter to jail. And she also implies that his daughter will be tried as an adult and end up in the same harsh prison as Bloodsport, where she'll likely be killed. As we've already established, this inciting incident doesn't feel very genuine because of the conflict it presents with Bloodsport's own weakness and moral need. The fact that he is willing to make this sacrifice of doing something that he didn't want to do. His initial desire was to not join the Suicide Squad, and now he is willing to make a sacrifice in the name of his daughter, which directly contradicts that initial moral weakness that we saw, that he does not care about others and doesn't treat them well. So the next step in the Harmon story circle is search, which is really all about adapting to new circumstances, meeting the main players outside of the protagonist, the allies, the opponents, and the objective that are set before them. In this case, it's Bloodsport joining up with the rest of the members of the Suicide Squad. We learn about Operation Starfish. We learn about the coup, which threatens U.S. relations. And we learn about the squad that Bloodsport will be escorting, including Peacemaker, Ratcatcher 2, Polka Dot Man, and King Shark. So in the search phase, we're also having the stakes laid out before us, which is that this country is being overtaken by a ruthless dictator who is in control of some technology called Operation Starfish. This will in turn threaten the US government, as if it falls into the wrong hands, it can be used against the US. And now, along the way, we're going to have several trials that the Suicide Squad has to overcome, including their failed assault at the beach at the beginning of the movie, accidentally killing the rebels who were helping Rick Flag, and then finding the Thinker in the bar and rescuing Harley. Now, I noted in my reaction video that I thought that the villains of the Suicide Squad were particularly weak, and what I mean by that is not only are they physically not intimidating, but they don't challenge our protagonist's core moral weakness, which is something that a good villain should do. So in this case, Bloodsport's weakness is his lack of care to others. So how could we create a villain that would attack that? Well, there are a few ways. You can create a villain who has the antithesis weakness, which is somebody who is perhaps too caring or is very magnanimous. You could create a villain who is very charismatic and magnanimous, somebody who is a leader of others, who seems to treat others and thus cause further strain on the relationship with Bloodsport. And I think with the ultimate reveal that Peacemaker turns out to be a secondary antagonist, they really could have created a situation where Peacemaker is sort of this charismatic leader, and while Bloodsport is a bit standoffish, people sort of tend to gravitate a little bit more towards Peacemaker, who is, very much the all-American red, white, and blue, I'm the best, I'm the leader type. Or they could have made it so that one of the generals who has taken control in the coup is a very charismatic leader, somebody who's able to inspire and rally the troops around them. And perhaps Bloodsport, because he doesn't care about others, angers the people, and they are more willing to help their new leader and sell out Bloodsport. So this could cause conflict because the way that Bloodsport treats others is causing a disadvantage to him that the villain can exploit. Moving to the next step in Harmon's story circle, we have Find. This is about the halfway point of the movie. This is what's called by Truby the first revelation, Change's Desire, and the Plan. This is sort of the point of the story where the hero's objective is going to shift, but they're also going to begin to have the ultimate revelation that is going to change their character by the end of the movie. And here we can very clearly identify that first revelation comes during that bus ride when Bloodsport and Ratcatcher 2 sort of have that little bonding moment, that little discussion where she asks him why he's afraid of rats. We get a little bit of his backstory, a little bit of a insight into how his relationship with his daughter kind of contrasts to Ratcatcher and her father. This is also where the desire changes. Previously to this point, their mission was to find the Thinker. At this point, they eventually will find the Thinker, and their objective is going to change to, we need to save Harley, and also we need to finish our incursion into the Jotunheim and destroy Operation Starfish. Even though this seems like a very small portion of the story circle in terms of all the steps that happen, it's actually very important because here we get a lot of character development. We get to see Bloodsport softened a bit when it comes to being around others and treating them better. Obviously that scene in the bus, but I also mentioned in my reaction video that I loved that bar scene where everybody in the Suicide Squad was hanging out and kind of laughing together. And you really do see in that portion that Bloodsport sort of is becoming more and more of a part of that crew, but also becoming a leader of that crew when he sacrifices his freedom along with Rick Flag and Peacemaker to allow Ratcatcher and Polka Dot Man to get the Thinker out of the bar unnoticed. So next we move on to the Tig Stage, and while this has 5 different sub-plot points that Truby mentioned, only 3 of these are actually in the Suicide Squad. And again, that's not a bad thing. Not every single point of Truby's 22-step process for writing a story needs to be a part of every story, and in this case, there were only 3. The fake ally opponent, the apparent defeat, and the audience revelation. So we'll start with the fake ally opponent, and obviously this refers to Peacemaker. Peacemaker eventually turns on Rick Flag and the rest of the group because Rick Flag wants to get the information about Project Starfish out to the rest of the world, revealing the American government's involvement in this project because he believes that is the morally correct thing to do. On the other hand, we have Peacemaker, who believes in preserving peace at all costs, regardless of who has to be sacrificed or what morals need to be sacrificed. And since revealing this information about the US government's involvement in creating this starfish weapon, he thinks it'll cause an international incident and thus stands opposed to it at the prospect that it will disturb the peace. Now, my issue with this is twofold. Number one, we don't understand really how this revelation that America was involved in Project Starfish would cause an international incident. The only people who would probably be affected and angry by this are the citizens of Corto Maltese, and they might be destroyed, and they're also going through a massive upheaval. Maybe his belief is that if this information is released and there are democratic elections, that the people of this country will elect a leader who is opposed to the United States, but that seems like a bit of a leap of logic. So then we move on to the apparent defeat. Now, the apparent defeat is really kind of just the fact that Starro gets out and manages to, start taking over the corpses of the people in the army of Corto Maltese. This is the low point of the movie. It's also, you can also throw in the point where Rick Flag is killed because he is the in-name leader of the Suicide Squad, and losing him is what you would think is going to cause the group to lose their morals, lose their luster, and maybe start to break up, maybe start to question the mission. And that's another big problem, is that Rick Flag's death really doesn't have any impact on the Suicide Squad, the group as a whole. I would much rather have seen a scenario where Rick Flag's death really does kind of leave them wounded and wondering who is going to step up, and that's sort of the impetus behind Bloodsport actually needing to become the leader. He can't stand to the side and just pretend like he doesn't care about these people and let Rick Flag be the one in charge. He is going to have to step up and understand that that is his role. And finally, the audience revelation is really kind of related to the whole Peacemaker thing. It's the fact that we know that Peacemaker is now playing the other side as some of the action is happening. This really comes into play when we have Peacemaker kind of skulking around during that scene where they're setting up the bombs and coming back up, in quotes, Rick Flag and Ratcatcher. So next we get the return step, and this is the point of the story where our hero or heroes are at their lowest. They have suffered the apparent defeat, all hope seems to be lost, and they need to have one or potentially two final revelations to realize how they are going to ultimately come to success. In this case, you can see that moment of the second revelation coming at the point where Bloodsport turns around in defiance of Amanda Waller and decides that he is going to stop being selfish and actually help the people of the city. And that's a very powerful scene. It was very great. I really did like it. And then the third revelation actually comes during the course of the battle when Bloodsport realizes that he is the leader of the Suicide Squad, and he begins to act like the leader. This is the part where he has made the decision to become the fully actualized version of himself, become the leader that Waller always knew that he could be, and they proceed to get into the battle. They fight Starro. There are, a couple of near-death experiences. Harley going into the eye of Starro, King Shark getting tossed into the building, and, ultimately they go through the gauntlet, and they manage to sick a bunch of rats on a giant starfish and help Harley Quinn kill him. But at the end of it all, we get to the final step of the Dan Harmon story circle, the last part of the movie, that's the change. This is where we see our hero becoming the fully actualized version of themselves. They make the final moral decision to become this better changed person, and they lead the story into a new equilibrium. And obviously, this comes after Bloodsport negotiates with Amanda Waller that he and the rest of his team will be freed. You know, he holds onto the footage that Rick Flag was trying to send to the press and uses that as leverage, proving that he does care about the others because he uses it for their benefit. And he also shows a lot of kindness to Harley and to Sebastian the Rat, which kind of emphasizes that he has grown and has become a bit more of a less selfish person, that he is somebody who is capable of caring about others and becoming a leader. And so we are left with him sailing off into the sunset, as it were, as sort of understanding his role as a new leader of the Suicide Squad. So that's it. That's the story structure of the Suicide Squad. And in general, now that I'm going back through it and having watched the movie a second time, I do see that the story structure is better than I initially gave it credit for. I think the biggest problem that I still have is, number one, the fact that we don't really have the backstory on especially Bloodsport, but also these other key characters, namely Rick Flag and to a lesser extent, but not really, Harley Quinn. We don't know who Bloodsport is. We don't know what has caused him to be in the state that he is, and because of that, we don't really get a good anchoring on what his motivation is before his initial changes. For Harley Quinn, we do know what she has been through insofar as the original Suicide Squad and then Birds of Prey. That is useful information, but it doesn't really inform us why she has become a bit more reserved and a bit more jokey, as opposed to in the previous two entries when she was a bit more, frankly, just psychotic. And then for Rick Flag, I know a lot of people have praised the fact that Rick Flag has become sort of a different character from this movie as opposed to the first Suicide Squad, and I agree, it's a change for the better. My problem is we don't understand why that change has happened, because we, again, don't have any context as to what he has been through prior to this movie. And again, this is another instance of sort of treating the original Suicide Squad as not existing, but also kind of existing. As I mentioned throughout this video, another problem is the villains and how little they actually impact the story. You can make the argument that in terms of moving Bloodsport and Harley Quinn's character development along, Peacemaker was more important to that as a villain than either of the two presidents/generals or Starro. And that's very disappointing, to have a villain just not impact a character's growth whatsoever. But overall, I have to say that the Suicide Squad is a very solid film in terms of following the story structure that Dan Harmon and John Truby have kind of laid out for us. It does hit just about every single one of the points that you want it to. And that's not to say that by hitting a checklist, that means that a movie is good. It's purely subjective, and it's purely about how it makes you feel. To me, it makes me feel better when I get invested in characters with good plot lines who develop over the course of the movie, or even if not, because there are some movies where that does not happen, if the plot is just incredibly interesting. And in this case, Bloodsport did develop a good bit. It's just I really would have liked to have a little bit more to anchor me to him at the beginning, so I could be feeling a bit more invested in him as the movie went forward, because his change could have been very, very impactful. I just didn't have as much anchored to it. But that's all for me, guys. Thank you for watching. Please do the like, subscribe, all that crap. Very much appreciate it. It'll help the channel grow a good deal. I am going to do a couple of mini spin-off discussions, really quick ones that are going to talk about Bloodsport and Harley Quinn, and then I will be back soon with another reaction video. Catch you later.